Hi, and welcome back to Short Videos on Archaeology. Today we're going to talk about ritual, liminal states, and the supernatural in the archaeological record. When we think of rituals, we often think of them as the cornerstone of religions. We think of formal rituals like the celebration of the Catholic Mass, ancient Egyptian burial rites, and baptism. However, rituals don't always need to be formal religious events. Rituals are simply repetitive social practices composed of a sequence of symbolic activities set apart from ordinary social routines. In America, getting a 21-year-old drunk for the first time, legally that is, can be considered a ritual. And my dog does a little dance every time I feed him. That too can be considered a ritual. Sit. Stay. Okay. So why does this matter? I'm guessing most of you just saw supernatural in the title and got excited. Well, from an anthropological standpoint, rituals are important because they are activities that bind the community together through a specific ideology expressed through action. Rituals reinforce religious beliefs and identity through a shared experience. They don't always represent current beliefs or identities, though. Sometimes rituals harken back to ancestral or mythical concepts no longer relevant to today. You can see the perfect example of this in the first season of the TV show Outlander with the ritual around the Standing Stones. Rituals can be understood as rites of passage. In 1909, European folklorist Arnold van Gennep wrote this book called Le Rite de Passage, in which he suggested that most events in a human life go through three stages: the preliminaire, that which happens before; the liminaire, that which is transitional; and the post-liminaire, that which happens after. Most scholars, of course, are only interested in the liminaire, because that's when things happen. For most cultures, the liminary stage is the most dangerous part of a rite of passage, because once it starts, the participants are neither one thing nor the other. They are betwixt and between. The classic anthropological example of this is death, because once someone dies, they're not fully dead until their body goes through a ritual marking their transcendence into the next life. In Europe, the transition into the next life is intimately tied to the decomposition of the body. So when a body doesn't decay in European culture, it's usually an indication that something is wrong. Naturally, mummies are the embodiment of this fear, because ancient Egyptian burial rites tried to preserve the body as best they could. So when European archaeologists began bringing these preserved corpses back from Egypt with them, they instantly became icons of horror, trapped in a liminal state. Liminality and horror go hand in hand for most cultures, and variations on creatures trapped in a liminal state are seen the world over. Vampires, for instance, are fairly cross-cultural, with the European variant being the most popular today, but with the Jiangshi, or Chinese hopping vampire, still being a staple of Hong Kong cinema. Likewise, shapeshifters are common in almost every culture as well, with movies like The Wolfman bringing the werewolf to the forefront, but in African mythology, werecats are probably more common, and in Japan, the kitsune, or werefox, is equally frightening. Ghosts and spirits are pretty standard, and don't even seem to have much variation between cultures. So how does this relate to archaeology other than just in the general anthropological sense? Well, in most places, archaeologists find these things called deviant burials. Burials that, for lack of a better word, are just bizarre, and seem to suggest some form of punishment that's meant to carry forward into the next life. For whatever reason, these burials are often associated with vampires. Probably the most famous example of this is the so-called Vampire of Venice. This was a body dug up in a plague pit in a little island off the coast of Venice. The remains were that of a woman, probably a little older in age, and as you can see from this picture, she had a brick rammed down her throat before she was buried. So the second this body was found, speculation ran wild, because vampires in medieval Italy were often associated with plague, and, to a lesser extent, with spinsters. And placing something in the mouth of a vampire was a historically known way to prevent them from rising and attacking people. So here was a deviant burial at the confluence of several of the hallmarks for vampire burials. Researchers began to speculate that this was a spinster who was accused of bringing plague upon those people she was buried with. Of course, this is wild speculation, but it fits the evidence. Still, some scholars doubted that this was actually a vampire burial, and instead have suggested that the brick fell into this woman's mouth after she was buried. I don't see how this could possibly be an accident, but that's just my opinion. Perhaps even better evidence for the belief in vampires as seen through the archaeological record can be observed with recent findings in modern Bulgaria. In the past few years, several bodies have been found along the Black Sea with iron stakes driven through their heart to prevent them from rising from the grave. The stakes, of course, represent the release of these bodies from their liminal states. And without historical documents explaining what happened to these bodies, that's probably all we're going to understand from them archaeologically. But vampire burials are not the only form of deviant burials, and it appears that deviant burials aren't even limited to humans either. Recently, the skull of a wolf, one that probably suffered from a disease that deformed its skull, was found chained in a box in a field in Macedonia. Instantly, the internet was set ablaze with articles on the discovery of a werewolf skull. However, this skull seems to be somewhat unique, leading to questions on the authenticity of the find. Whether real or fake, it seems fitting that the skull was produced in Macedonia, neighbor to Greece, where the origins of the modern werewolf myth may have started. And I say this because one of the earliest known legends having to do with werewolves is that of Lycon of Arcadia, who was cursed to turn into a wolf after having fed Zeus the flesh of a human. Lycon's name, of course, is where we get the word lycanthropy, the disease of being a werewolf, and for fans of the franchise Underworld, it's where we get the word lichen. Because these myths are so common, and yet we know that werewolves, vampires, and other creatures trapped in a liminal state aren't real, scholars have spent an enormous amount of time and energy trying to figure out if there's a grain of truth in any of these legends. Rabies, for instance, seem to have a lot of similarities with reports of vampires and werewolves in the past. And some historians have tried to correlate outbreaks of rabies in the past with increased belief in vampires and werewolves and an increase in deviant burials. Likewise, mass psychoses brought on by things like rotten food has been a prime suspect as well. Of course, these are just functional explanations for what could bring about belief in these creatures. Social explanations may be just as appropriate. Throughout human history, the masses have always been suspicious of those who deviate from social norms. People who don't marry and don't have children are often thought to have something wrong with them, and suicide has long been frowned upon. Migrants, too, are often the victims of severe mistrust. In fact, the book Dracula is actually about xenophobia and the fear that both vampires and foreigners bring with them disease. Based on this association between vampires and foreigners perpetuated by books like Dracula, archaeologists used to think that vampire cemeteries found in places like Poland and Bulgaria were actually full of migrants. Recent biogeochemical analyses, however, have largely debunked this notion, showing that vampire cemeteries in Poland at least are largely comprised of local populations, and suggesting that the association between foreigners and vampires may be more of a modern phenomenon. In spite of what we've learned about deviant burials and the life of those who have been buried as vampires, witches, and werewolves, there's been a lot of controversy associated with their study. Many scholars feel that studies, such as those highlighted here, only serve to exploit the misfortune of those in the past. They argue that these were once living people, whose only crime was typically to fall victim to sexist or racist plots against them. However, I would argue that this largely ignores that things that are stuck in a liminal state are no longer perceived the same way they were in the past. Today, vampires, werewolves, and other creatures that have long since been the mainstay of popular horror are now the heroes of modern fiction. And so now there's an element of romanticism attached to these discoveries that help victims in the past reclaim some of the dignity that they once lost. Whether or not you feel that these studies are exploitative, the underlying cross-cultural fear of liminal states makes them important areas of anthropological investigation. And I hope you've enjoyed watching this presentation as much as I've enjoyed putting it together for you.